The fifth and final rule for categorical syllogisms is this. If both premises are universal, then the conclusion cannot be particular, unless we're working from the Aristotelian standpoint. Okay, so let's take a look at what this means. Here's an argument. All apples are fruit. All fruit are delicious things. Some delicious things are apples. Now, the first thing we do when we're evaluating these arguments by applying the rules is we mark our distributed terms. Both of our premises are A statements, and all A statements distribute their subject terms. Our conclusion is an I statement, and I statements don't distribute any terms. So now that we've marked all of our distributed terms, we're just going to roll through the 5 rules in order. Rule number 1 says your middle term better be distributed at least one time. Our middle term here is fruit. It's distributed here in the second premise, so we can check off the requirements of rule number 1. Rule number 2 says if you have a term that's distributed in your conclusion, it better also be distributed in a premise. But if you don't have any terms that are distributed in the conclusion, and we don't, then rule number 2 doesn't even apply. We can just blow right past it. Rule number 2 says you can't have 2 negative premises. And we don't. We have 2 affirmative premises. So rule number 3 is adhered to. Rule number 4 says, if you have a negative premise, you better have a negative conclusion. And if you have a negative conclusion, you better have a negative premise. But we don't have any negative statements at all. So rule number 4 doesn't apply. And that's where we run into a wall with rule number 5. Both premises of this argument are universal statements. A statements and E statements are universal statements. And the conclusion statement of this argument is particular. It's an I statement. And I statements and O statements are particular. Okay, so that tells us that from the Boolean standpoint, this argument is invalid, and it's invalid because it commits the existential fallacy. Remember Boole's assumption, or his lack of assumption. What Boole says is, when I make universal statements about all apples, or all fruit, or all delicious things, I'm not actually implying or assuming that the things I'm talking about exist in reality. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But you can't draw a conclusion that there exists at least one of these things in reality from my statements about all of them. Okay, so when we look at this argument, that's exactly what it's doing, is it's telling us something about all apples and all fruit, and then it's drawing a conclusion about some number of these things. And we can't do that from the Boolean standpoint. So rule number 5 tells us that this argument is invalid from the Boolean standpoint. But if none of the first 4 rules were violated, and it's the 5th only that's in question, then that argument is conditionally valid from the Aristotelian standpoint. Okay? And when we say that it's conditionally valid, what we're saying is, from the Aristotelian standpoint, this argument is valid as long as the critical term of the argument exists. In other words, either the minor term, the major term, or the middle term is the critical term. And the critical term is the term that has to refer to something that exists in reality in order for the argument to be valid from the Aristotelian standpoint. Now, we're looking at this argument and it's not real clear. Well, what's the critical term here? Is it apples, fruit, or delicious things? And one way we can figure out what the critical term is we can determine the argument's form and then consult our inventory of conditionally valid forms. The argument here is an AAI in figure 4, because we see our middle terms are joined by a line that slopes upward from left to right. And when we pull out our inventory of conditionally valid forms and look at the column for figure 4, we find the mood of our argument right down here at the bottom, and that tells us that P has to exist. P is the predicate of the conclusion, or the major term. So according to our inventory of conditionally valid forms, this argument is valid as long as apples exist. Do they? Yeah. So we've met the condition for validity from the Aristotelian standpoint for this particular argument. Now, what if, horror of horrors, you don't have your inventory of conditionally valid forms handy? Somehow you left home without it, and you've come across this argument and you want to know, oh my gosh, does the critical term exist? What if this argument, it talks about gnomes or unicorns or leprechauns, and I don't know if those are the critical terms, and whether or not this argument is valid or invalid is going to hinge on that. Because if the critical term refers to something that doesn't exist in reality, then this argument is going to be invalid from the Aristotelian standpoint as well, because it will commit the existential fallacy. But if the critical term refers to something that exists in reality, then the condition will have been met for validity, and I'll have a valid argument from the Aristotelian standpoint. So if I don't have my inventory of my inventory of conditionally valid forms, and I can't determine what the required condition is or what the critical term is, I can find the term in the argument that is superfluously distributed. Okay, so here's a new fancy term for you. Superfluously. What does that mean? It means more than necessary. Okay? And in this case, it means you have a term in the argument that's distributed, and its distribution has no relevance whatsoever to the rules for categorical syllogisms. So the first two rules of categorical syllogism has to do with distribution. The first one says your middle term has to be distributed at least once, and the second rule says if you have a term that's distributed in the conclusion, it better also be distributed in the premise. Here we have the term fruit is our middle term. And that term is distributed that term is distributed one time. And that's exactly what's required. It's the minimum that's required to comply with rule number 1. If you have a term, the middle term has to be distributed at least one time. And it is distributed once and once only. Okay, so that's not distributed more than it needs to be. Look up here though. Apples is distributed in the first premise. It's not the middle term, so its distribution in the first premise doesn't do anything related to rule number 1. And apples is not distributed here in the conclusion. So it doesn't have its distribution has no impact on rule number 2. So apples is distributed, but it doesn't have to be in order to comply with the 5 rules. And that tells us that apples is the critical term. Okay, so if you leave home without your inventory of conditionally valid forms, take heart, you can identify the superfluously distributed term in your argument, and that tells you what the critical term of the argument is, the condition that has to be met for validity from the Aristotelian standpoint. Now, one final thing I want you to take note of is this. These 5 rules apply equally and in the same way from the Boolean standpoint. So if an argument breaks any one of these 5 rules from the Boolean standpoint, they're all sort of making it equally problematic as an argument. However, that's not exactly the case from the Aristotelian standpoint. And it's not the case from the Aristotelian standpoint because rule number 5 refers not just to the form of the argument, but to the content as well. The first 4 rules apply only to the form, according to the Aristotelian standpoint. But the 5th rule applies to form and content. And what that means is this, is that if I have an argument that doesn't violate any of the first 4 rules, and it comes up against only rule number 5, and I determine that the critical term of this argument doesn't refer to something that exists in reality, it refers to like a leprechaun or a unicorn, then the condition for validity won't have been met from the Aristotelian standpoint. And that argument will be invalid by the existential fallacy. But if I swapped out the content of the argument and I took out the word unicorn and I put in the word horse, now maybe I've met the condition for validity from the Aristotelian standpoint because my critical term refers to something that actually exists. And now I have what appears to be a valid argument. But I can't do that same type of swap out with regard to rules number 1 through 4 because those rules refer just to an argument's form, not its content. So I can swap out the content all night and day in an argument that violates any rule 1 through 4, and nothing's going to make that argument valid. Okay, so if an argument violates any of the first 4 rules from the Aristotelian standpoint, we don't even bother with rule number 5. Rule number 5 applies only when the argument hasn't violated any of the first 4 rules.